Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Farah Kimji, your 2020 Toronto Crew President, and we are so happy to have all of you join us online for today's professional development webinar. Before we jump into today's content, I wanted to share a few announcements of upcoming events. So I'll just wait for that slide to flip. So coming soon, we have an event on June 3rd, and it is on how design, construction, furniture, and technology all work together to create long-term resilient workplaces. So be sure to register and join us for that. We then also have a virtual happy hour coming up on June 9th, the next edition of our book club on June 17th, and a fireside chat that we'll be having with Taya Cook to learn about the development that she's been a part of, and the next installment of the Elevate Your Careers professional development series. So, and we also have some upcoming coffee chats with our board. So stay tuned for all of that. You can register through our e-blast as well as on the website. So I would now like to take a moment to also thank our 2020 sponsors. As displayed in the presentation here, your sponsorship allows us to continue to deliver relevant and important programming for our members, even through these challenging times. And we are very appreciative of your support for Toronto Crew. So thank you to all of our sponsors. I'd like to now just address a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. Everyone is all on mute and without camera. There is a chat function where you can say hi and see who else has joined us for today's session, so feel free to jump in there. And there's a separate Q&A function for you to submit your questions during the presentation. For all of you joining us today, you know, the mission of Toronto Crew really is that we are dedicated to helping women excel, influence, and lead throughout their real estate careers. During this time, our board has thought of what that really means given the current landscape. And we feel that offering programs that support the professional development of our members, even as many of us work from home, and is very important. So today, I am very excited to share with you guys and announce sort of the second edition of our Building Block series. I know the presenters today have worked very hard on the content for this learning session. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Patricia Arsenault, an EVP from Altus Group, as the moderator for today's event. And she will further introduce the topic and our speakers. Patricia, thank you.
Great, thank you, Farah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Farah already said, this is the second session in the Building Block series. And if you're not quite aware of what the whole purpose of it is, really in basic terms, the intent of the Building Blocks is to provide the membership with some working knowledge of various aspects of the real estate industry that they may not be as familiar with. So today's topic is due diligence. And I'm guessing for many of you, this may be the first non-COVID focused webinar you've attended in quite a while. So doesn't mean we're not going to talk anywhere about COVID, but it's not the focus of this presentation. So we have a great session for you today. So let's get to it. Just in the presentation today, our speakers are going to be taking you through the various stages in a commercial property transaction, and in particular, the process that is called due diligence. So if you're only somewhat familiar with what that means, by the time you're done with the session, you'll have a pretty good understanding of it. And luckily, we didn't need to look any further than from within our own Toronto Crew membership to find experts to help us understand the workings of each of these stages. So our first speaker is Melissa Nowak. She's a senior associate with Hauser, Henry & Siren, which is a boutique law firm focusing on commercial real estate. Melissa has over 15 billion in a transactional experience, having spent 12 years in-house at a global commercial real estate group before she moved into private practice. Our second speaker is Emily Forrester, who graduated from the University of Guelph's Real Estate and Housing program in 2011, and then she began her career at Allied REIT. Currently, as Manager of Acquisitions at Allied, Emily is responsible for completion of underwriting and onboarding for all purchase and sales transactions nationally, and she's completed almost $2 billion in transactions for the REIT. Our third speaker is Alexandra Benelli, who's a partner at Bennett Jones. In Alex's commercial real estate practice, she has vast experience working on a variety of commercial transactions, including acquisitions and dispositions, land development, asset management, construction, and project finance. So thank you, Melissa, Emily, and Alex for joining us today and allowing us to benefit from your wealth of experience. So before we get into the actual presentation, I just have a couple of things as well. As Farah already did mention, you can use the Q&A function to ask any questions. Chat is for little side conversations, but the Q&A is where we'll actually take questions. You can ask the questions at any time, but we will have specific points within the presentation where we're going to pause to answer them. So if your question is specific to a particular slide, you might want to include the slide number. That would be helpful for the presenters. Also, as Farah said, we're going to be recording the session. We also will be making the presentation materials available after the call, so you don't need to worry about screen capturing or doing any of those things. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to start things off. Melissa, you may be on mute.
Okay, I'll start over. Sorry about that. Okay, thank you, Patricia. To begin our discussion today, we are going to walk through an overview of a transaction timeline. Although our session focuses on the due diligence period, it is important to understand how this period fits within the overall transaction timeline and which parties are involved at various stages. For this session, we thought understanding how a due diligence process works was best demonstrated through a brokered development opportunity. Due diligence in commercial real estate purchases is an exercise in testing your assumptions on the factors that contribute to the purchase price. These include planning, environmental, rental income, and timelines for development. In a brokered offering, these assumptions are presented by a brokerage on behalf of an owner. The broker invites qualified buyers to bid on the offering and provides these buyers with pricing guidance based on the brokerage's assumptions. So in our case here, we will start with the offering period. I will play the role of the brokerage who wins the mandate to list the redevelopment site for the sale on behalf of the owner. My team has underwritten the pricing and packaged the opportunity to present to the qualified buyers. The purpose of a brokered offering is to drive up competition and pricing and to obtain the best terms available for the sale of the site. Without the pressure of a competitive bid process, a buyer in a non-competitive scenario has no incentive to push themselves on pricing or timelines. This brings us to the bidding period. On the bid date, Emily, along with a few other bidders, will submit a bid on the basis of preliminary underwriting. She will win our bidding process and perform a in-depth due diligence on all of the elements she based her pricing upon. Emily will hire Alex of Benelli LLP as her legal advisor to assist her in negotiating an agreement of purchase and sale, shown here as the negotiation period. Once the agreement of purchase and sale is signed, we begin the due diligence period. Emily and Alex will divvy up the due diligence investigations and perform their due diligence. At the end of this period, Emily will present her findings to me as the seller's representative. So now we're going to move on to the offering. Next slide, please. So I present to you 3 Finch Avenue, East Toronto. This is an incredible high-rise mixed-use redevelopment opportunity. It's perfect for developers looking to add a high-value mixed-use development to their portfolio in one of Toronto's most rapidly expanding areas. Its excellent transit-oriented location is adjacent to the Finch Transit Hub, which has TTC, GO, YRT, and Viva Transit. It's a prime site for redevelopment at 64,000 square feet, which can accommodate a 24-story, 205,000 residential development with commercial at grade. This site features holding income through short-term tenancies. The current leases provide approximately $82,000 of NOI, and each lease contains a demolition clause. Okay, next slide, please. So here we're showing an overview of the planning regulations that govern the site. We start with the official plan, then hone in on the specific bylaws which govern this site and tell us the permitted building height and property use. We've also included a rent roll. Oops, oh, that's me. Sorry. We've also included a rent roll summarizing the income and terms of leases in place at the site. These tenancies will obviously have to be terminated to permit the redevelopment, but each lease has a demolition clause permitting the landlord to terminate the tenant for demolition upon the provision of 6 months prior notice. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we had a massing study done to demonstrate visually the potential development that could be built upon the site within the planning specifications. So you can see here that we have a 24-story high-rise residential development, and you can see the floor-by-floor areas that the building envelope will permit. So all of these features form the basis upon which we, as the owner's representative, derived our pricing guidance, which is $190 per square foot of buildable density. In our discussions with potential buyers, we walk them through these site metrics and tell them that our valuation and the owner's expectations are $190 per square foot of buildable density, which on a 208,000 square foot development equal approximately $39.5 million. Okay, next slide, please. So throughout the course of this offering period, I have been contacting buyers who would be ideal for this site to solicit a bid on our bid date. The bid date is when the brokerage's underwriting assumptions are tested. I pitched to sell this development site with a valuation of $190 per square foot. This was a conservative value, giving other brokerages valued it as high as $215 to $220 per square foot. We were conservative on value, given the unwillingness of the seller to perform environmental studies, and given we were not provided with actual leases to verify the terms. We had to base our assumptions on the landlord's rent roll, which sometimes does not truly reflect the state of the leases. As such, we backed down our pricing assumptions. So as you can see here, the bids were submitted on a non-binding letter of intent, which frames the primary business points of a purchase. These points are the overall purchase price, the due diligence timeline, and the closing timeline. The pricing metrics are obviously very relevant, but the timelines are also important because the longer the deal is conditional, the more market influences beyond a seller's control can risk the deal. Factors such as COVID, for example. Even once due diligence conditions are waived, the deal is firm and binding. The seller does not have the funds in their pocket until closing. So every moment until that point is important to a seller. So here the bids are showing us that we did our job. We valued the site at $190 per square foot, but the competitive pressure drove the top pricing to over $200 per square foot. We're feeling okay for now, but will this pricing hold through the due diligence period? When we talk about a potential renegotiation of the purchase price after due diligence is performed, we will revisit these bids. So summarizing the bids, Emily Co. came in at $41.6 million. Emily Co. is a reputable buyer known to close with other development projects within their portfolio. So we know she's very capable of building the site and understands the complications of construction. Melco came in at the same price, but our seller does not like the longer due diligence period of 60 days. And they also do not like the structured closing with a vendor take back mortgage and not closing until rezoning, which could be 18 months out. Alex Co. is an interesting bid. It's very lucrative given it is firm, meaning that there will be no due diligence period. As soon as the APS is signed, this deal would be firm and binding and would move toward closing. The issue here is that Alex Co. has never built a development, and when asked during the offering period about her sources of financing, she did not have them yet arranged. So this bid, although attractive, doesn't instill confidence in us that the buyer understands the risks in development, doesn't understand the site, and can actually find the funds to successfully close the deal. So we're going to pass on Alex. Karen Co. is a lower priced bid, and the timelines are simply too long for our seller's comfort. So after deliberation with our owner, we have selected Emily Co. as our successful bidder. So now I'll congratulate Emily Co. and turn it over to Emily to walk us through formalizing the letter of intent into an agreement of purchase and sale. So over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Melissa. Can everybody, I think we're good, we're sound. Now that we at Emily Co. have been selected as the winning bid, the next step is to negotiate a binding purchase agreement. So to give you some color on the normal or standard process and what goes on kind of behind the scenes, as Melissa outlined, typically in a competitive bidding process, all the bidders will submit offers to the broker on a term sheet or a non-binding letter of intent, which outlines those top of mind terms that are really the backbone of the deal. So that being purchase price, due diligence period, closing period, any conditions, deposits, or anything along that are any of those terms. So we start with those non-binding documents to nail down the basic stuff, and then we work towards a binding purchase agreement. So in the letter of intent, there's usually a time period established in which there's about 10 days. It's normally what I see is about 10 days whereby both parties agree to work together to negotiate and finalize the form of agreement. So one party will provide the baseline form, and then both sides go back and forth finalizing the language and the formal terms. So this is the time when those other kind of like less glamorous terms, like any specific representations and warranties, which could outline what the vendor can legally guarantee about the property or about their ownership, any due diligence deliveries that we would require, any estoppel requirements from the tenants, any of these would be negotiated and ironed out during this time. So you'll see on this slide that this deal is as is where is. It's an as is where is transaction, which essentially outlines that the property is to be taken as is without any representations or warranties with respect to the condition, the permitted future use, any of the environmental issues, or any of the tenancies. It's solely the purchaser's responsibility to do their own investigations into each area that they're concerned about. In most cases, purchasers will request that they have a condition for financing, which is much like what you would do when you're purchasing a home for yourself. And maybe a condition for environmental or physical condition review. Some purchasers will request more conditions, for example, a lease up condition, which would be satisfied after a tenant renews a lease or something along those lines. So the number of conditions you can get away with solely depends on how competitive the bid process is and the type of property. So it's very similar to when you're buying a home. With respect to this deal, it was competitive and we really wanted the property. So we only included one condition to be satisfied with our due diligence review. That's what our 30 days is for. So we've included that due diligence materials must be provided within 5 days of execution of the agreement, so the leases and the rent roll. And once we have completed all of our due diligence, it's in our sole and unfettered discretion whether the results of these investigations are satisfactory to us. So depending on what we determine, we can decide whether we want to waive or not waive our condition. So at this point, we've executed the agreement to purchase the sale and have made our agreement to purchase binding. And it's now time for our team to kick our underwriting into high gear. So here's that timeline again. If we could flip to the next slide, please. Here's that timeline again, just to give you an update on where we are in the process. So you'll see we've now had a chance to digest the offering material. We were selected as a successful bidder, and we have a binding agreement to purchase, which brings us to April 1st, 2020. The clock for our due diligence period of 30 days starts now. So now it's time for us to really dive in. We're going to take a quick break for questions since that was quite a bit of information. I'll pass over to Patricia. Oh, Patricia, I think you're on mute.
Correct. I am on mute. Again, just a reminder to use the Q&A function if you do have any questions. I'm going to start with one. There, on an earlier slide, I think it was slide 11, there was a reference to the terms density incentives and density transfers. Could you just give us like very briefly a definition for those, Melissa?
I'm just flipping to the slide. So slide 11. So I'm sorry, the question, the first part was density.
Yeah, the terms density incentives and density transfers, just what, could you just describe what that means a little bit for people?
When we're talking about density on a redevelopment site, we're talking about how many square feet we can build on the redevelopment site. So I'm constantly referring to a price per square foot of buildable density. And that's our apples to apples comparison on a price per square foot basis of what can be achieved on the site. So I'm always reducing it to that because, for example, if our due diligence finds that we can't build the site at the density that I'm projecting, our purchase price obviously goes down. But does it go down as a result of the overall density available, or does it go down as a result of the actual price per square foot? Because other factors will influence that, and I think Emily will speak to it in her due diligence part.
Yeah, also just to follow up on what Melissa said, some of those density incentives that the city might have, or density transfers, sometimes they allow you, if you have another site nearby, they'll allow you to forego the future density on that site and add it to your current site, or, you know, depending on conditions, they'll give you density incentives if you pay extra to, put in a larger park than what's required, or some items like that. It can get very complicated, but I have seen that happen in the past. So that's kind of what that means by density incentives and density transfers. Okay, do we have any other questions?
We do. So I think this one will probably be from Melissa. What role does the broker play in the bidding process to help advise the bidders on terms to consider that would close the deal?
So the brokerage is hired on behalf of the owner, and the brokerage is really the face of the offering. So what they're doing is they're acting as a buffer between ownership, and they're creating this environment where everybody has to submit bids in accordance with a very structured process to ensure that, one, everyone's treated fairly, and to ensure that, two, we can look at everything on a real-time basis of comparison. So what the broker is doing is basically imposing an environment on a bidding process that will drive up the competitive nature of the bids.
That's great. Okay, next question. This was probably for Emily. So you had the bid price. How exactly did you come up with that value? Without being too specific, what kind of methods do you use to arrive at the value that you were bidding?
So when we're kind of, usually what happens, at least in my experience, is the broker will present the opportunity, and you have usually about, 30 days or so to, like, before we get to an agreement stage, before we have to submit our bids, we usually have about 30 days to kind of digest the material that they've provided. So they would provide us with that rent schedule and the planning overview. And, the broker will give you kind of a baseline set of information that, that's what they've gathered from the vendor. So we take that time to digest. They'll give us basically the first step of information so that we can use our simple metrics to kind of estimate where we think the value will be. So in this offering, they had said, we expect to be able to build 218,000 square feet. So we kind of take that to heart, essentially. And because we don't have more information yet, we would base our pricing off of that number. So, or something close to that based on our off the hand education. So in this case, we would just say, okay, so if we can build 218,000 square feet, market pricing in the area for that type of property is around 200 or like $190 to $200 per buildable square feet. So we'll offer based on what we expect the market pricing to be. So that $200 per buildable is kind of a market set metric, and it sort of helps to it's probably a good landing point to make a viable development financially. So that's kind of where the market shakes out on that. So that's how we would come to that number before we would offer. And then once we get accepted, then that's when you dive into the real due diligence, when you get all of the leasing or the leases to go through and do all that information then. So we would it's a bit of you kind of go in with a few questions before, but some information, and then you offer. And then after that, you get to actually kind of dive in and see all of the information and verify everything that you've offered upon.
Okay, great. We have one more question, I think, as well for you, Emily. It's from slide 14, where you'd mentioned that there's typically a timeline between the initial and additional deposit. Is there typically a timeline between the initial and additional deposit?
Yes. So normally when you sign up the purchase agreement and you get a binding agreement, you would submit your initial deposit. Usually they do 2 business days after you sign up the agreement. So that's when your initial deposit gets submitted, and that's held by your legal counsel or their legal counsel, depending on what you've what you've negotiated. So, and then once you go through your due diligence and if you waive conditions, at that point, then you would put in your additional deposit. So the initial goes in on the day of signing, the additional goes in on the day that you waive conditions.
Okay, and then can you also expand on what the condition for financing actually means?
So that would be if you want to be able to offer on something before you actually go to the bank or go to your partners or whoever it is to actually get funding approval to actually close the acquisition. So, you know, in a lot of cases, if you think about it from a residential perspective, when you're buying a home, especially in Toronto, the way that it is right now, you would go in and say, you know, yeah, we want this property really badly and we have to move quickly to get an offer in, but we don't necessarily have approval from the bank yet or from the people that are funding to be able to move forward on that. So you basically put in a time period and that's the time you get to actually secure lending for that, to make sure that you have the cash on closing. So that's what that condition would be. And if you can't get financing and you can't secure those funds, then you wouldn't waive your condition and the deal wouldn't proceed.
Okay, that's great. So I think we're going to move on to the next section, and I think you're up again on this section, Emily.
Yeah, perfect. So typically due diligence is completed by a combination of an internal group of individuals, so our internal team, and then as well as some external consultants and our legal team. So in my case, we've broken down our due diligence into 4 major categories: financial, environmental, planning, and legal and off title. So financial due diligence will be completed internally by our team. So that's going through kind of all the material that we've received and validating those assumptions that we made on pricing. Environmental, we'll hire third-party consultants and engineers to provide us with opinions on the site, and I'll get a little bit deeper into that in a minute. And then planning due diligence, which is also a combination of kind of our experience in the market as well as opinions from the external consultants that we would hire. Legal and off title, we've engaged Benelli LLP and Alex, so she'll speak to you all about that in a little while, but they would complete all of the legal and off title due diligence. So the main kind of overarching goal during due diligence is risk mitigation. Can we do whatever possible to verify information and ensure that we are entering into this purchase with our eyes completely open to any problems that might come forward over our ownership period? So if we could go to the next slide, that'd be great. So with respect to all of the financial details of the property, we have to determine how to substantiate and confirm all of the income and expenses at the property and complete a bunch of scenario analyses to determine if there are any differences to what was represented by Melissa and the brokerage in their offering memo, and kind of what our baseline assumptions were when we put the offer together in the first place. So just as an aside, I'm going to be mentioning risk quite a bit, and to give some color on what I mean by risk, it's important to know that, you know, different companies define risk or return in many different ways, but that could be with cap rates, IRR, or whatever, which all translate into essentially risk and return on an investment. So that's what I mean when I say risk or return. Is there enough of a return on the property to justify the level of risk that we are undertaking? So the broker has outlined that the property currently makes $82,000 in NOI. Can we substantiate this? Is it backed up by leases with tenants who are likely to actually pay their obligations? Can they pay their rent? Typically, we would complete a full lease review internally to back up this information. We want to determine what we would think our timeline is to achieve vacant possession. Do all the leases in fact have demolition clauses like Melissa outlined? What is the operating expense history at the property? Is the current income sufficient to cover our expenses while we attempt to delease the property? What will our return be if timing to delease actually takes longer than what we expected? We know that there will be a period of time between when we purchase the property and then when we can get it rezoned and approved for development, which is typically 2 to 3 years. So will we be able to actually run this property efficiently over that time without losing money? We would also complete a full market analysis to determine if we can actually achieve the rental rates that we require to make this development worth it once it's complete and the building is occupied. So you may have also heard recently that, you know, construction costs have been increasing at exponential rates over the past few years. This has been a really big roadblock for purchasers. How can we determine with reasonable certainty what our costs will be? What happens to our return if these costs go up? What is the impact of this on our appetite to actually buy the property? This is where a lot of that sensitivity analysis comes in. The financial portion is definitely one of the meatier portions of the process and requires a lot of time and attention. So While we're completing the financial due diligence, we have our environmental consultants working in tandem on inspecting the property and looking at the past uses and how these may affect the environmental condition of the site and the surrounding areas. So the consultants complete what is called a phase 1 environmental site assessment, which outlines the risk based on prior land uses in history and the presence of anything underground that might cause any contamination. If the phase 1 comes back with a potential for concern, we would be notified by the consultant, and then we'd proceed to complete a phase 2 assessment where they actually drill into the ground and test the soil and the water quality. Once we get the results of these studies, we can then determine if there will be any additional costs to expect should we have to remediate the contaminated soil when we dig down for this building. I'll break that down a little bit more later, but just on remediation and the implications of that. So also moving simultaneously are external planning consultants. So teams internally and externally review the current planning legislation for the city and verify what the property is currently zoned for, which is kind of known as the as of right zoning. So how much density has been achieved by the surrounding buildings factors into this. How much density can we realistically expect to achieve on this site is dependent on, neighboring buildings, the current planning rationale, kind of a bunch of different factors in the market. Based on the results of these findings, we can verify that we can in fact build the 205,000 square feet that Melissa outlined in her offering. Remember, we offered to pay $200 per buildable square feet. So if we can't expect to actually achieve this amount, then our price will have to go down. And then finally, while all of this has been going on, our legal team that we hired, Benelli LLP, led by Alex, is working on reviewing the condition of title at the property, as well as any encroachments, deficiency notices, or any other legal issues that we can expect down the road. And Alex will elaborate on that in a little bit. Once we receive and determine the results of all these investigations, we all come together internally and decide if any changes to our agreement are required or if we can, in fact, waive our conditions, being completely comfortable with the risk and the return on the site. I know this looks like a lot of questions and a lot of information, but this is definitely typical in a normal acquisitions process. These are the questions that, pretty well most teams, if not all of them, probably ask. It's really common. The teams of people are large and there's a lot of people working on all of the analysis at once. So that's why we build in that 30 days to go through the information. That's why our condition period is 30 days. I would say that's pretty standard timeline for a lot of deals. More aggressive deals will go to 15 days. Some deals go firm right off the bat without a due diligence period, much like Alex's offering in the bidding process. It really just depends on how aggressive you want to be. So fast forward, and now we've received the results of all of our underwriting from our internal team and our consultants that we've hired, and we've discovered some material issues with the property. So we found that one of the commercial tenants' leases does not in fact have a demolition clause, which means we can't vacate them in the time frame we need them to be out so we can begin demolition. This can create a big cost due to loss of time and cost to compensate the tenant to leave their premises before their natural expiry. So this can definitely be a very costly item because you obviously cannot demo a building with a tenant inside. So we also found that there are residential tenants on the second floor of the property, which brings in a whole other set of rules and legislation about relocating and possibly replacing the rental units that are in the new development. All of this has the potential to cost more money over time. So that's something that these two items are kind of related to the tenancies. Another material discovery was that our site is actually contaminated due to an underground storage tank. So as a result, we have to take special precaution when we dig down to what we call remediate the contaminated soil. So when we dig down to build, the contaminated soil actually has to be taken out of the ground. And, in a normal situation with normal soil, it's taken to a site somewhere, outside of Toronto or wherever it is, and it's put down and leveled out and forgotten about. Whereas contaminated soil has to be taken to an actual special site that's contained and the soil's treated, and it's just, it just obviously is much more costly to do that. Finally, we discovered that based on the current planning legislation, our knowledge of the city's desires with respect to land in the area and the surrounding heights in the area, We don't think it is realistic to believe we can build 205,000 square feet of density. This has a major impact on the income we can generate on our completed development. And it also in turn affects our price. So remember, we offered to pay $200 per buildable on the 205,000 square feet. If we can now only build 190,000 square feet, then our price drops substantially. So I know a lot of these issues look scary, especially the environmental contamination. But to give you some perspective, there are a very high number of contaminated sites in Toronto. It's actually becoming more common than not to encounter a contaminated site, especially in a city as old as Toronto that has so many historical uses. So if there was a gas station down the street, or the site was a gas station at some point, gas stations put tanks underground. A lot of older buildings, especially if you look, in downtown Toronto, there's a lot of older buildings that have old oil storage tanks for their furnaces, for the old boilers and furnaces and whatever else. They have these underground holding tanks, and these items sometimes aren't removed from the ground. So it's illegal, not illegal, but the city requires you to remove those tanks when you redevelop. And if they've leaked, then you have to remediate that soil. But that's very common on a development site. Doesn't really scare anyone, and likely would not cause anyone to walk away from a deal. They will make adjustments to their purchase price when necessary, or change their plans and assumptions slightly. So it becomes a cost issue as opposed to, you hear contaminated and you're like, oh my gosh, it's a safety issue. And there are cases where it becomes a safety issue for your occupants, but it's just another step in the process that you can definitely address and fix. So we'll walk through the impacts of all these items shortly, but first we're gonna break for questions. Then Alex from our legal counsel is going to walk us through some of the title and off-title due diligence.
Okay, great. So we have one question here that is, do you also commission a building condition assessment at the same time when you complete an environmental review?
Yes. So I know that our standard process is to always complete a building condition assessment. I think it's pretty common, especially if you're going for financing. Any bank is going to request this. So a building condition assessment, for those that don't know, is a report that basically, it's like a home inspection essentially, but on a much larger scale. So they walk through and look at, the structure, the foundation, the elevators, the HVAC, what condition it's all in, when does it need to be replaced, and they give you, an estimate of cost over time of when they expect that stuff to maybe not work anymore and its useful life, and they give you all that information. So it's kind of a great overview of the physical condition of the property. So yeah, we definitely would complete that.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the next section. And for that, we're going to ask Alex.
That's right. So thank you. So as Emily mentioned, she has retained my firm to conduct the legal review on the site. And just to give a little bit of background of what title and off-title review are and what our lawyers would do in these circumstances, title review and off-title review are often conducted by a team of both a lawyer and a law clerk, sometimes a few law clerks depending on how big the site is, or just depends how big your law firm is. Title typically review means review of registered instruments on title, and off-title review consists on searching either public records online or sending out inquiries to see what public records are available on the site. The number of searches that a lawyer will make in respect to the site will depend on the type of the site, the type of diligence that the purchaser is doing directly or through other consultants, and in some cases, whether or not the purchaser will be obtaining a title insurance policy, which could limit some of the searches that need to be conducted. To start, a law clerk typically pulls a title abstract for the property to confirm ownership and to summarize all instruments registered on title. In Ontario, most of the properties are now converted from old registry system into the land title system, and title granted upon conversion may be absolute or qualified. Depending on the qualification, different title searches may be required. A minority of parcels may still be under the old registry system, in which case title information can only be obtained by accessing physical records at the land registry office. In our case scenario, we have assumed that the lands have been converted so that we can do all searches electronically. So on the slide, you see some of the potential encumbrances that could be found on title. So these could be easements or rights of way agreements. These could be for access, utilities such as gas, water, electricity, telecom. They could be for special use. You could have a property where a neighboring owner could have access to your lands, to a well on your lands, for instance. They could be very specific or they could be more general. They could benefit or burden the property. There could be restrictive covenants registered on title, and these could be in favor of the municipality, the region, previous owner, or a neighbor. Restrictive covenants can prohibit transfers or charges without consent of a third party. They could contain development restrictions such as maximum density or height requirements. They could have a use restriction such as no hotels or gambling facilities on the site. It varies. It just depends on what the parties agreed to in the past. There could be bylaws, development agreements, or subdivision agreements registered on title, and these could contain restrictive covenants or positive obligations. So they could have things like landscaping responsibilities or sharing of costs for some common use areas between neighbors. There could be registered leases on title, and these typically are registered as notices of leases, and their main purpose is to show which tenancies are still in place and have priority against future registrations. And there could be charges or other liens on title, and these could be mortgages or construction liens. So basically, what is on title will depend on what was required or agreed to by previous owners. Sometimes those encumbrances may no longer be required or have expired, and a lawyer can assist in discharging such instruments. So a title review could also include a review of thank you. Title review can also include a review of Crown patent reservations and a Crown patent's original grant of lands from the Crown to private entities. And they could show any limits placed by the Crown on the use of such lands. So for instance, some lands could only be used for agriculture purposes. Crown patent can also show what rights the Crown has kept back when granting the land to private ownership, which means often it would include any waterway. So if you have a creek running through a property, that could be excluded from your ownership rights, or mineral rights is often an exclusion as well under Crown patent. Title to adjacent lands for Planning Act contraventions would also be reviewed by your lawyer, and that would be reviewed to make sure that the current owner does not own any adjacent lands, which would require severance consent under the Planning Act in order to separate title before you could purchase the title. Access rights would also be reviewed to make sure that the property has direct access to a public road and is not landlocked. This would be done through reviewing the legal description, any registered reference plans, and any available surveys. A lawyer would also look at chain of ownership through corporate searches to make sure that all previous corporate owners existed at the time of their ownership of the land, so that the lands did not at any time revert back to the Crown. How far you have to search for previous owners will depend on the qualifier imposed by the land registry system when the lands were converted into land titles. So next slide now. Great. So we will, after the webinar, provide a sample of a title review summary, because it's actually a lot of information that you would typically get from a lawyer. So you'll get a handout for those interested to take a look at what a full title review could look like for a site like this. But we have picked out on the slide some of the potential issues that you could see. And in this case, we picked 4 different things. We said that there's a servicing easement in favor of Toronto Hydel. So this is likely for pipelines, access, and maintenance. It's very typical to see, but its location may conflict with any development plans. So that's why it's important to see where this easement is, whether it's blanket easement over the entire property or a more specific one. There's also a development agreement. We said in 2002, the city entered into with the City of Toronto, but it contains a prohibition against development of any buildings over 4 stories. So this is a problem, since we note that our purchaser is planning to build a much higher building. There's also a notice of cash money lease, which has expired on October 31st, 2017. But we see from the notice that there was an option to renew for 5 years. So we would have to confirm if the option has been exercised and whether or not the lease is still valid. And there's also a charge in favor of Bank of Montreal. So sometimes charges could be assumed by the purchaser if that's part of the deal. In this case, we were not planning to assume any of the charges, so we will need to get the charge discharged. And that's something that the seller will have to deal with on closing. Sorry about that. Okay. So a review, also we had an available survey that we looked at, and we noticed that there's a curb encroaching 0.3 meters onto the street. So we would ask for further diligence to see if there's any encroachment agreement with the city with respect to curb encroachment. So these are the main title issues that I would bring up to Emily's attention prior to the expiry of diligence period. Next slide, please. Sorry. Okay, so there's typical off-title inquiries that we would send out for. And these would include the municipal tax department with respect to realty taxes, municipal water department and utilities with respect to any unpaid accounts and unregistered easements, municipal building department with respect to any zoning compliance issues, any open work orders, any open building permits, or if there's any septic tanks at the property. We would also write inquiries to the Ontario's Electrical Safety Authority to see if there are any work orders or deficiencies. In their records, we would send out, if applicable, inquiries to Ontario Conservation Authority to make sure that there's no restrictions, conservation type restrictions placed on the property or breaches of any such regulations on their files. We would send out inquiries to Fire Department and Public Health Department with respect to any outstanding orders that they may have on their files, and Ontario's Technical Standards and Safety Authority to make sure that there's no underground, or if there are any underground storage tanks, any elevators, and to see if there's any deficiency notices with respect to those. These are just a sample of off-title inquiries. There's more that we could potentially send out. If there's railway tracks near the property, if there's a cemetery, or we think there might have been a cemetery, we would send out additional searches. But these are sort of the typical ones that we included and we would typically send out. So again, you're going to get a copy of our off-title inquiries that we sort of made up for the site, but you would see a lot more searches in that sample that you're going to get in the handout after this webinar. So next slide, please. Okay, so lawyers will often also complete corporate searches, and this would be called off-title searches as well. And these are done against the seller. And these are to make sure, I'm sorry, I'm still having issues. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so these would be to make sure that the seller entity exists. So corporate profile would be done to make sure that the corporation still exists and to see who the principals are. So it's just to make sure that we're dealing with the people that have authority to sign on behalf of the seller. We would do also Personal Property and Security Act searches, often referred to as Ppsa. And this is to see if there are any security interest in any personal property located at the property that may be subject to the agreement of purchase and sale. Often chattels are excluded from any land purchase agreements, but sometimes equipment could be sold with the lands, and there could be other contents in the building that are sold. And we would just want to make sure that there's no personal property security interest attached to those. Or if there's any registrations, we would have to make sure that they don't attach to anything that's coming over with the sale of the lands. We would also conduct insolvency and bankruptcy searches, and these are to make sure that the seller is not subject to any insolvency proceedings which could delay or cause issues to the current sale. Same with litigation searches. We would see if there's anything out there against the seller or the property that would affect this current sale. Next slide, please. Okay, so out of our case study, we came up with a few things that we're going to point out to Emily because they're an issue. Our building and zoning review has indicated that this property is zoned residential. Obviously, that's an issue because we need commercial usage. That's something that Emily would have known already anyway through her planning review, but that also complements her review, and it's something that they're going to have to deal with in the redevelopment process. Our corporate searches showed that Ppsa registration in favor of Bank Montreal is registered. That affects the property. Not a surprise, given that we already seen that there's a charge in favor of BMO, so we would ask for that Ppsa registration to be deleted or discharged before the closing, along with the charge. From the Electrical Safety Authority, we have received information there's an open work orders. We would have to find out more information as to what that work order is with respect to and ask the seller to deal with it before closing. And Bridge Gas, we received that there's an outstanding account. We would ask the seller to settle that account before closing. Same with Realty Taxes. We received information that there's an unpaid 2019 interest and an upcoming installment. So we would make sure that the seller has paid any unpaid interest, and we would, depending on when the closing is, either do an updated title tax certificate search to see if the taxes have been paid and if the upcoming installment has been paid, or ask the seller for added evidence of that payment before closing. And from TSSA, we've received notice that there's underground storage tanks, which basically puts us on notice that there could potentially be some environmental issues and a higher risk of leaks. And we would advise the clients to do more environmental review if they haven't done so already, because we know that there's underground storage tanks. Next slide, please. Okay. So when we would be presenting our review to the client, they would get a copy of both title and off-title summaries that you're going to see in the handout with lots of information in it. But really what they're interested in is what is out there, what are the problems, what do we have to deal with. In our case, from the legal review, we've came up with a few issues that we would have to highlight to the client. And this includes what we've already went through, a servicing easement and a building height restriction, which may affect the future development plans. So as part of the development process, we would advise the purchaser that they may need to renegotiate a new easement with Toronto Hydro, and they may need to amend the height restriction or ask this deal with the city to negotiate a new development agreement in order to allow for a height restriction that would be suitable for the proposed development. This means more diligence time may be required because these two entities dealing with the city, as people know, takes a while, and to be comfortable enough to make sure that the city is going to renegotiate the height restriction, and if the easement has to be moved, that the Toronto Hydro will allow for that movement. You'll likely need more time than 30 days in order to get the comfort that you need that the proposed development can work on the site. So with respect to the cash money lease, we know that it may have expired, but there could be an option to renew. So we would just ask for confirmation whether the option has been exercised. Typically, that would be a renewal notice that the seller can send to us. If it has expired, the notice of lease should be removed. And the reason for that is it's just going to clear up title and allow for less issues when we finance the property later on, or if we decide to sell or do any other thing with the property. A BMO charge we know has been registered on title, and there's a related Ppsa registration. So again, unless the charge is being assumed, the seller will need to provide clear title and closing. And that's something that we deal with very often, that there's old charges that have to be paid out and discharged on closing, and the seller would typically ask for a payout letter from their lender. And we would deal with sometimes complicated, sometimes easy type of escrow arrangement to get the money into the lender so that they can provide the discharge of the charge on closing. There's also a survey that we noticed shows an encroachment. I've mentioned that there could be an encroachment agreement with the city. We have assumed that there's no such encroachment agreement, so we've mentioned that we would advise the purchaser to ask for additional reps with respect to encroachment to make sure that the encroachment does not, that there hasn't been any notices from the city with respect to the encroachment on file, and maybe ask for additional things such as indemnity in case there's a problem and we have to go ahead and remove the curb. Taxes and the guest accounts, we know that there's some outstanding amounts. We would just ask for those to be made current before the closing, and that's something the seller will have to deal with. Work order, so we would need more information to figure out what that work order is, and we would have to address the order and maybe order that the seller would have to order an inspection to get it closed. There's also, we know, a property that under one of our inquiries, we figure out that there's underground storage tanks, so we know that a phase 2 environmental assessment may be required, and that's something we know Emily's already dealing with because she's hired environmental consultants who are already conducted their review on including a phase 2. So this is really some of the legal title and off-title issues, and just the main issues that we present to Emily, and that would be all done before the end of the diligence period so that she can use our information along with what she has collected from the various consultants in her own review and decide what to do as next steps with respect to this deal. So any questions?
No, I think we're good to go on to the next section.
Awesome. So based on all the findings that we've outlined, we've quantified the additional costs and the risk that we have to take into account and what our asks will be from the vendor. So this is really similar to what you would do when you get a home inspection, when you're purchasing a residential home. You would go back to the seller for an adjustment in purchase price if you found any issues. So yeah, same process, just on a bit of a larger monetary scale. So we want to ask for a price reduction of $500K to assist us in vacating that commercial tenant that didn't have a demo clause. We would have to spend time, negotiating with that tenant, and likely it all comes down to money. In most cases, the tenant will want to be compensated for leaving their space early and having to terminate their commitment to lease. So usually that results in some kind of payment. If those discussions don't go the way that we would plan, then that could potentially add more time to our timeline and, time is money. So if the development's held up, that means we don't get our return as soon as we had hoped. So that's why we're asking for the $500K discount. We would ask for another $100,000 to assist us in vacating and replacing the residential rental unit. So based on, you know, city legislation and some of the requirements, we would have to actually replace that unit and, you know, put another rental unit back into the market, the one that we've taken away. So we would have to compensate, or sorry, we would have to account for that in our pro forma for our development, and that's obviously a cost. And then we would also have to, it's very difficult to vacate a residential tenant. We would have to essentially give them monetary compensation in order to leave. So that's basically the $100K is to just account for our time and money in that scenario. We would ask for an extra $1 million off the purchase price to pay for the remediation costs on the site due to the soil contamination from that underground storage tank. So because we have to relocate that soil into a different area and, you know, it's treated differently, there's a substantial cost increase for that. So that's why we would ask for that $1 million haircut. Perhaps kind of the most substantial haircut is to ask for $2.6 million reduction in the purchase price due to the likelihood that we are not going to be able to build the 205,000 square feet. So we would be estimating that we'd only get 195,000 square feet. And so we would go back to the vendor and ask for that reduction based on our rationalization of why we think that this building will not achieve this. We would also ask for an extension of 30 days to discuss the easement issues that Alex outlined that she found in her her title due diligence with Toronto Hydro, and then some amendments to the purchase agreement to protect us with respect to the encroachments and the work orders that were also found. So we just want to do a little bit more investigating in that case, which we would need to get consent for a little more time to complete. So at this point, we'll now bring this to Melissa as the listing broker and outline our needs, and that, you know, we really are interested in the property still. We really want to waive our conditions and close really smoothly. Our funding's in place, we're ready to go, but unfortunately some concessions are going to have to be made to the price in order to compensate us for these additional risks. So I'll pass on to Melissa, who will break down the next steps for us. Oh, there.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you, Emily. Since I'm the agent for the seller, I have to say I'm quite disappointed. This was a very competitive process. I can't believe you're coming to me with an adjustment, but we'll deal with all that next. So I just want to reframe this transaction in terms of our timeline. So after we signed our purchase and sale agreement, we can populate the dates within the timeline, which you can see below. Now let's look at the participants who are involved throughout the transaction timeline. During the offering period, we have typically thousands of qualified buyers to whom this opportunity is marketed. As we approach the bid date, which was March 3rd, we hone in on buyers who have shown key interest throughout the offering period and are likely to submit bids. Here it was Emily Co., Mel Co., Alex Co., and Karen Co. We then selected Emily Co., and she selected Benelli LLP as her legal advisor. Throughout the course of the negotiation period and the due diligence period, our seller team was exclusive with Emily Co. and her legal advisor. So those are the only participants you see at that stage of the process. Upon the due diligence date, Emily Co. has a choice. She can waive her conditions without a change and move on to closing, or she can renegotiate. Emily Co. is choosing to renegotiate. In effect, instead of cleanly waiving her condition, she is now counter offering on the deal at a reduced purchase price and at a longer timeline. As the seller's broker, I advise the seller to re-examine the bids we received, which demonstrate what the marketplace was saying. So this is why Mel Co., Alex Co., and Karen Co. come back into the picture on the due diligence waiver date. When I selected Emily Co. as the buyer, I had to call Mel Co., Alex Co., and Karen Co. to let them know that we were moving in a different direction. Some buyers took this opportunity to let the seller know that if things don't work out with Emily Co., our selected buyer, they would still be interested. Mel Co. and Karen Co. did this when we informed them of our decision. Some buyers revealed that they were just throwing a number at the wall in hopes of tying up the deal on an exclusive basis, while they figure out the details on planning, environmental, and financing. This was the case when I spoke to Alex Co., our firm bidder, and what made us suspect that her bid wasn't in fact firm. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. So now let's look at the implications. So what does an owner do when the purchaser asks for a price reduction and extra time on waiver? So I will ask the seller to evaluate, firstly, whether the other offers are suddenly more lucrative now that we have a diligenced purchase price. Also, I'll ask them to evaluate whether the adjustments the purchaser is seeking can be validated and have the reports peer reviewed. This is important. If an adjustment can be validated, we can make the assumption that other bidders we may consider after performing their due diligence will detect the very same issues. So here, my recommendation is to have the seller's consultant peer review the purchaser's environmental report to see if that $1 million adjustment is reasonable based on the findings, or if it's inflated, which they can often be. And I'll also ask them to peer review the purchaser's third-party planning report to determine how the reduction in density was derived that accounted for the $2.6 million adjustment. Again, we are just trying to evaluate if any other buyer who diligenced the site would arrive with the very same issues. I just want to pause here and discuss the potential of tricking another buyer. I raised this because I worked for an investment sales team for a number of years, and I have been asked a number of times by sellers whether they could select another buyer who would miss these major issues raised in due diligence. Asked enough times, I sense some of you may have the same question. So I want to mention that on a commercial sale of this magnitude, there's almost always a lender. A lender will not lend unless they can be satisfied on due diligence findings. So it is not a reasonable assumption that a seller can trick another buyer into purchasing and missing these major items. These issues will indeed be detected. So going back to our implications, we peer reviewed the reports and determined that their findings with respect to environmental and planning are valid. However, there was some padding in the cost of the environmental remediation. So my recommendation to the seller will be to push back on the environmental cost, asking for a $500,000 reduction rather than a $1 million reduction, and land on a purchase price of $37.9 million. So why? When we compare this revised timing and pricing against the other bids, it is still strong. We only have an additional 30 days in front of us for the isolated title issue to resolve. And we have a true price based on objective findings. If we compare this new deal to Melco and Karen Co.'s bid, we have to keep in mind that they are still subject to due diligence and are likely to find the same environmental and planning issues. So their purchase prices would also be adjusted, and they have not yet started their due diligence period, nor even negotiated a purchase and sale agreement with us. So we are currently firm on pricing and much closer to closing, even with our amended deal to Emily Co. So my final recommendation is to accept the 30-day extension and renegotiate a $3.7 million adjustment rather than the $4.2 million adjustment asked for. Now, the seller would counter with this proposal, and if it is accepted, which I think Emily is accepting, we can enter into an amendment to the agreement of purchase and sale, and our due diligence is complete. Okay, so Emily, do you accept the counter proposal?
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now next slide, please. So now we're just going to summarize what we learned. So the due diligence exercise is all about testing your assumptions against what a third party can validate. You don't want to take anyone's word for it. You prove them by objective means. The pressure points in a deal are all about timing and money. You can find a number of issues throughout due diligence, but if you can't actually quantify them in terms of time and money, you can't ask for them on your adjustment. Lastly, presentation is key. A seller wants assurance that any adjustment is based upon validated, objective data. They're not going to take the buyer's word for it. Every investment committee, conversely, wants proof that they are getting the best deal. So the due diligence exercise is performed on an objective basis to demonstrate both propositions. Okay, so this concludes our session, and I'll just turn it over to Patricia and anyone that has any questions. Thank you.
That's great. Are there any more questions? We do have one that did come in on the legal side. So this would be for Alex. Regarding the legal section, if a situation arises where one purchases a property that was under a leased fee interest, what would be the process to change it to a leasehold interest for the purchaser?
So I am a little confused about the question, because you could have a leasehold interest and just under a lease, and you would just get an assignment of that lease, and there would be no changes on title. Or you could be buying a property as a leasehold separate interest on title, and maybe that's what the question is for. And in that case, you would just get the transfer of that leasehold title like you would transfer a freehold title, except it would still be a leasehold parcel subject to whatever restrictions are under that lease that you're buying the property under. So you would get an assignment of lease, and you could do a registered transfer of the owners if there's a separate leasehold parcel registered on title. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, or if this question is has additional parts, please send additional questions on it.
Right. So let's assume that does answer it, and the questioner can follow up if it needs some additional clarification. We have another one, and I guess this could be for anyone. What are some reasons a buyer might actually walk away? Things that are so big that there's just no resolution to it. So maybe we'll ask the buyer, Emily, if you want to tackle that one.
I think aside from, not being able to get financing or, market conditions, like in this situation with COVID, a lot of deals that were kind of in progress fell through because, you just can't expect to know what's going to happen in the next 6 to 8 months. So, those are reasons, like kind of those external macro conditions would definitely affect things. But, when you're running through your due diligence process, things that might cause somebody to walk away is if, there's more than one tenant that doesn't have a demo clause. That would be something that would be, we'd have to evaluate the financial impact of that and, the risk associated, and potentially negotiate a price decrease to compensate us for that. So again, it's kind of an agreement between the buyer and the seller. Once you bring those issues to light, like, is there financial compensation, and is that available? And if that's not, then do you walk away? Other things that, I have heard about happening are with respect to environmental. So a lot of issues with environmental, I'd say the majority of issues are, you can fix the problem. So if there's an underground storage tank similar to this situation, it's very easy to remediate that, because you're digging down to build the parking lot anyways. So you're going to be moving that soil, and at that time you can take that storage tank out. But there are situations, where a landlord isn't aware that there's an underground storage tank that has leaked, and the soil's so contaminated that it's actually releasing fumes into the tenant's space, and you get an air quality test and you've determined that it's contaminated. And if you're not planning to develop that site, then it's very difficult to rip up the floor of an existing building to pull out and remediate all that soil. So in a situation like that, you may want to say, okay, it's not like, this cost could be astronomical. The risks are so high. Like, a tenant, has the right to a safe space. If they find that there's this issue, like, we don't want to assume that liability. That's a situation where somebody might walk away. Another, with respect to environmental, is if it's one thing if your site is contaminated, but if it's found that you have, or that your site and the contamination on your site has leaked to someone else's neighboring property, the owner is also on the hook for any damages that might ensue because of that. So if your underground storage tank has fuel in it from years ago, and that fuel is leaked over to a neighboring site, and they have to pay for remediation of their site, or they can't get financing because of it, or whatever, and you're found to be at fault, the purchaser would assume all of that risk. So that could be a situation where you might walk away. I'm trying to think of any other things. Ladies, if you have anything to add, let me know.
I have some odd ones, not necessarily walk away, but definitely delay the transaction greatly. And this is a very odd one, is barn swallows. So if you're buying probably out of the city, I mean, in city of Toronto, you wouldn't have that. But if you're buying development property out, where there's lots of nature, you could have nature issues. We had turtle issues on one side, we had barn swallows on the other side, where you have to wait to do certain additional studies, and those have to be done seasonally when they're mating and various things, and it could delay a transaction by up to a year or even more, depending on what outcome is, and what regulations are put in place, whether or not you can still develop on those sites. So a lot of development type issues could postpone or sometimes kill a deal, but in this case we didn't have development conditions, we had just the diligence conditions. So unfortunately Emily would have to take a lot of risk, and if she's not able to get the comfort that she needs from the city and Hydra and whatever else she's doing within the additional 30 days, she would have to make a decision whether or not to go ahead, buy the property and trust that she can do something with it, or just walk away, because there's no way you would get all the development permits and plans set out in such a short period of time. You would need a longer condition, which is possible with some sites and not possible with others.
Yeah, we've actually heard of situations where, you know, a developer has done a phase 2 study and actually done drilling, and part of a phase 1 and phase 2, they really go back into history to look at, you know, fire plans and things like that from the 1800s to see, you know, what was actually on the site at that time. Was it an old post office, or, you know, was it a gas station, or whatever it is? And they actually have found that sites are Aboriginal burial grounds, which is something that, you know, in the city of Toronto has happened, and, you know, like there's situations where there's been archaeological digs that have to happen on sites because they found these locations that are, you know, of historical significance. So like the grave site, for example, is extremely sensitive. The timing to go through, it's an archaeological dig. It's also extremely sensitive because it's an Aboriginal issue. So there's a whole bunch of other kind of legislative bodies that become involved, and, you know, a purchaser might just be like, this is not worth the time, or, you know, we're going to lose too much money waiting for all this stuff. So, you know what, like, let's just walk away from the deal. So there's some things that are just, you know, too hard for somebody to financially digest. So they may say, you know what, vendor, you deal with this issue now that you're aware of it, and you deal with it. And when it's all dealt with and everything's finished up, then you can approach us again, or bring your building back to market, or whatever it is, because every purchaser would find those issues. So that's what we've run into.
Well, that's great. You've given us a lot of caution when we go out to buy our next building. So I think we'll wrap up the session now. We can move on to that next slide, the last slide there. Okay, great. So just a reminder, Farah went through these earlier about our upcoming events. I would like to thank all our speakers today. Great job, Melissa, Emily, and Alex. I'd also like to thank the Professional Development Committee for organizing this great learning session. In particular for this one, Lee Rosar, Anna Lopez, Pauline Petrie, Sofia Laselva, Tatiana Zalar, and Karen Sweet. And then just a final thank you to all of you for joining us today. Goodbye and take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.